If you honestly, genuinely think about your deployment, how many games do you win because of where you've specifically put your models? Realistically, it's not that many. But how many games do you lose because of where you put your models? That's what we're going to talk about today. Deployment is one of the most important and worst understood parts of any various fantasy game. Because you're moving in much more limited ways than something like Age of Sigmar or 40k, where your deployment is important, but you can kind of just go, screw it, I move diagonally, it doesn't matter. In Old World, it really does matter, especially if you're playing slower units, if you're playing infantry. So some armies really do suffer from it. Is it important to get perfect deployment? It's nice. I don't think I have perfect deployment. I don't think I'm qualified to tell you how to give perfect deployment. But what I can do is tell you how to avoid bad deployment, how I think about deployment, sort of work through it holistically. This is a less focused on a specific angle than the other videos in this series so far. This is more about how to approach deployment, what sort of things you want to avoid, how to get better at it. There are two things that you need to consider before you actually get to the game in terms of deployment. And the first one is list building. List building is the first thing to consider. Now, there are a few different ways you can do this. Obviously, the terrain that you're playing on is going to factor into this as well, which we'll talk about in a second. But the number one thing is, do you want to go first? Or do you want to see where your opponent's dropping? That's the sort of fundamental list building aspect that you need to go between. A good example of this is an Empire gunline list. Gunlines are really good if they go first and they have chance to shoot their opponents. However, if your opponents manage to hide everything, your gunline's kind of ineffective. You're not going to get much use out of it. So you could write an Empire 5 war machines. War machines are counted as one drop. That's something you've got to be aware of. So when you're writing your lists, you need to have at least 3 units that are non-characters, and then that doesn't include swarms, doesn't include war machines. You can have at minimum, I believe it's 5 drops or 4 drops, 5 if you're going for a gunline list with loads of artillery. So you could, in theory, go first or have the +1 to go first in all or most of your games, which is a huge advantage in terms of the go first, go second roll off. I believe it puts you at something like 65-70% chance to go first. So if you think that the most important thing for your list is going first, low number of drops, really good. Maybe you're less bothered about that. Maybe you've got other ways of slowing your opponent down. You're playing a gun line, but you've got an illusion caster. You've got lots of chaff units that you're going to throw in front of your opponent so that they, get tied up. Maybe that's the way that you want to go. In that case, maybe you put in loads of core Empire archers, for example. You can do that very easily. A 45-point unit that you just throw down anywhere, somewhere just to fill up space. You can use them to screen against enemy shooting. You can put them into marching columns so you can fire them forwards and use them as little redirectors. All of the annoying things that you can do with small units like that, probably a subject for a future video, actually. I think that's a really interesting topic that we can get into. But maybe you think it's more important to see where your opponent's going to put down their high-value target. Maybe you're playing against Tomb Kings, they've got a couple of Necrosphinxes. You want to cannon those Necrosphinxes. Sure. You don't want them to be, hidden out of sight or out of a reasonable angle to shoot them. So you put all your chaff drops down. Great. Fantastic. Now you can see where you're going to put your stuff. You've got the line of sight. And if you do get the first turn, you're able to light them up. And if they get first turn, well, they have to come into the middle of the board anyway to deal with you. Gunlines aren't the only army that might want to go first. If you're playing something, I really like a dragon with arcane urgency. I find my turn 1 win rate, if I go first, I win most of my games. It gives you that threat that you can drop a dragon in front of their unit before they manage to get out of their positioning, set up some overlapping charges, any of the good stuff there. So maybe you've got something that you want to play very aggressively with and get forwards, or maybe your list is weak to shooting, for example, and knowing that if you go first, you have less turns that you're going to be shot. That's quite important. So there's another time that you might want to go low on the number of drops. A third thing to think about when you're looking at writing the list is maybe your army doesn't get to choose, or maybe the go first decision isn't on the dice roll. We're talking about Bretonnian Grand Army, where you pray for the blessing of the lady, you get your ward save across the board, but as a trade-off for that, you do go second. Or another good one is Wolves of the Sea. Wolves of the Sea is a really interesting one because you can write a list with lots of chaff drops, and honestly, you're encouraged to do so through the army list. The Berserkers are very good, very cheap. You can take loads of them, and you can also put them into ambush if needs be. We'll get to that in a second. So you've got the flexibility to have 12, 15 drops very comfortably, but also have the pretty high chance of going first when you win the challenge that Wolves of the Sea have. Unit Champion Challenge. If you win it, you go first. So in that case, you're probably looking to write a list with loads of Berserkers. So you can do, an average list you might play against is maybe 6 to 8 drops. Sure. Your first 6 to 8 drops are going to be loads of chaff core units that you don't care about all too much. That's a really strong way to have the advantage in the deployment zone, so you can see what your opponent's going to do and then still have that very high chance of going first. That's a really strong strategy to build around. Finally, on the list building angle, something that you can do is flex picks, and that is scouts and it is ambushes. Now, scouts has been FAQ'd. It's now very clear that if you have scouts in your army and you deploy them as scouts, that does count towards who goes second. So if you have scouts, your opponent doesn't have scouts, you're always going to be giving up the +1 to the go first turn roll off. That's fine. Sometimes that's worth doing. You also don't have to deploy them as scouts if you don't want to. It gives you flexibility. Ambushes as well. I don't like ambush as a rule in terms of a unit that you want to do something aggressive with. I think putting a unit into ambush with the goal to get in the back lines and be useful that way it's risky. You've got to make the roll off. It can go very poorly. I don't love that. But ambushes as a flexibility so that you can drop your number of units that you have to deploy. I think that's a really strong strategy. Wolves of the Sea does this very well, and obviously they don't necessarily always want to use it, but sometimes you come up against someone who you're not going to be able to beat. Let's say you're playing against High Elves. The High Elf player's got a unit Swordmasters. The Swordmaster unit champion has a Ring of Fury as well. Between the fact that it's got an incredible attack speed, it's got cleaving blow, it's got multiple attacks, it's got a hammer hand ring that you can cast as well, you're probably not going to win the challenge to go first. So you probably just want to go for putting units into ambush, making sure you've got less drops than your opponent, getting up the board, because Wolves of the Sea is a very aggressive army, and going first with that sort of army is very strong. Now, the second thing you want to be considerate of is the terrain format that you're going to be playing on. A lot of places I know use the TSN Arenas or square-based map pack. So that is 6 pieces of terrain, 2 woods, 2 buildings, and then 2 hills. The actual dimensions of the building and the wood might change slightly depending on what your local scene has to use, but they are symmetrical, and there are 3 different maps for each setting. So here you can see A, here you can see B, C is very similar. It just changes the location. It gives you a bit of flexibility as such. Another format that you might see people playing, which has got more and more popularity recently, is the WTC maps. Now, these are not symmetrical and have very different rules. So here you can see a bit of impassable terrain down here in the bottom left. You've got a wood, we know what woods do, but then you've got dangerous terrain in the center here, dangerous terrain for the swamp, got a hill, some difficult terrain, and a low linear obstacle. Now, this is very different to the maps that we've just been looking at. This means that which side you deploy on actually makes a difference as well. So that's important to have. If we go back to something like the open battle here, it doesn't matter where I am. Look at it from this side. Look at it from this side. You can see it's exactly the same. It doesn't make a difference. So something to consider is what sort of terrain you're playing on, and that is also going to inform your list building style. So on a map like this, where there is a lot of open space here in the center, if I just go like so, look at all of this space. You've also got good angles of attack from here. You can come in sideways, and you can also funnel in from this side as well. It's a little bit more limited, but it does kind of signpost where you're going to want to deploy. Now, if we go back to one of the WTC maps, you can see that actually it's a lot less simple to move around in the center. And I think deployment is harder and more important if you're playing on a map like this with less non-symmetrical terrain and also stuff in the center. It is a rulebook rule that there is nothing within 12 inches of the center, so really this should be all clear here. But I don't think it's a problem that people are changing things around. It does make games more dynamic, which is quite fun. So if we're looking specifically at this sort of terrain, you can see that actually all of your deployment is free and you can go where you want, but you're not going to realistically, because this bit of terrain here, this doesn't block line of sight. Neither does this, and neither does this. So you're not really getting much in terms of defensive stats. I believe neither of them even give light cover. They might do when you're stood in them, and I'd have to double check. But if you're stood behind it, I don't think they give any cover. So you're not actually getting any benefit to being stood here with something that wants to move forward. So if you've got an infantry unit, you're probably not putting it there. In fact, let's have a... let's just create a unit so I can move that around. Perfect. So we've got a nice brick of Bestigor. Fantastic stuff. Here's the Bestigor. We're probably not going to put them behind the terrain. This is just going to slow us down. You know, we've got a movement of 5, which is good. But if we want to march through, instead of moving 10 inches, which would put us to here, if we were next to it, you instead only move 8 inches, losing an inch on the movement for the difficult terrain. You know this is fairly standard stuff, so there's not really any advantage to going here. And you see this is where the map style changes things, because if you've got this sort of map style, cavalry and chariots are actually a lot harder to play with because you've got more stuff to move around with. This one's not too bad, but if you were to change the deployment and if you were to change the actual map you're on, so let's have a look at 4, for example. So this one is quite difficult to move around the center. You can see there's a couple of low linear obstacles here. So if you're playing chariots, this actually really limits to, you can go here, you can go here, you can kind of go here and move up and round, and then you've got this space as well. But you lose all of this, all of this, all of this realistically. So it limits where certain units are going to go. How important is it? Well, here's an example. I joined an online tournament and I dropped after only 2 games because I had thought it'd be fun to play a full mounted / cavalry list, which is Heralds of Darkness. Obviously, I really like the Heralds of Darkness thematically. I think they're fun. I think the chariots are great. But I didn't really look into the mission pack beforehand. That's on me. That's my fault. I found that I was playing on maps like this, and getting around the board is what we can only really call a nightmare. So let's say you've deployed a unit of cavalry. There's not really a good place to deploy them on this map because you're going to be dealing with the terrain. The line of sight blocking terrain is going to lower your movement. If you're inside it or you're charging through it, you're going to be taking the lower of 2d6. It's going to be very difficult to get anywhere with an infantry or cavalry army. So I could, let's say, move my Chaos Knight unit here, march them 1.7 inches, then I'm at 6.4, then I can wheel around to clean the gap, 3.7. This is only an approximation. I've basically moved here, and that's about my entire movement. And that puts me in a terrible spot. So playing big buses of cavalry, very difficult to actually do anything with. The same with chariots as well. I could go here, and this gives me very limited angles of attack. I can aim to go up this way, or I can aim to move through here, but I've already got a unit that wants to go through here, so I'm bottlenecked through this. You really don't want to be taking chariots to this sort of map where you're going to struggle to bring them to bear, and also chariots very vulnerable to dangerous terrain, take D3 wounds instead of just a single wound. That's all of the pre-game thinking out of the way, or at least the stuff that I do. If there's anything else that you do that I have missed there, do let me know down in the comments. But we've done all the pre-tournament or pre-game thinking, and now we're at the table. We've got an opponent. We know what we're playing against. We've talked about lists. We have a good idea of what we want to play against. What do we do then? Well, the main thing you want to do is not box yourself in. We talked a little bit about that on the Warhol version that I just showed you there. You don't want to put your units in a way that they can't move around the board. And you also don't want to put them out of the way. But it really comes down to, are you a fast unit? Are you, in fact, let's go back to video 1. Are you the beatdown or are you the control? If you're the control, you probably want to bunker up a little bit more. You want to make it very difficult for your opponent to get in, use your, overlapping auras or the ability of have multiple units supporting each other, that sort of stuff. If you are the aggressor, if you're the beatdown, maybe go a little bit more spread wide. You want to make it so that you're looking for a spot to pick out of your opponent's deployment where you can get in, you can find an angle that they haven't managed to set up correctly. Maybe it's about killing one of their screening units that they've left in an angle so that when you overrun, you actually get into the unit that you want to charge against, something like that. So you have to think about how the matchup goes. And if you understand whether you're the one who wants to play aggressive or not, that's going to really help in terms of where you end up deploying your units. Here's an example of the recent game I played in the online WTC Cup against Pash. I'll link the video to it down below. He did record the full thing if you want to hear how the game goes, the interactions between the two of us. So I won't spoil it in case you do want to watch. But we're playing on Mountain Pass, and Pash has got quite an aggressive list. He's playing a full send chaos list with basically a big bus of chaos knights with assorted characters in there, a chaos lord, a couple of wizards, got a warpfire dragon to support, a single Shartak dragon ogre, and then some chaff, some warhounds, and some marauder horsemen. As for me, I'm playing a dragon that is less killy than, some of the dragons you might see, but it is very defensively equipped. I've got a couple of units of Silver Helms and Illyrian Reavers to run on my core, and then I've got a big brick of Sisters of Avalon, and the Sisters of Avalon are supported by multiple characters. So I've got a shooting Death Star that wants to teleport around the board with TMP. When I thought about this, I was like, okay, what's my opponent's plan going to be? Well, my opponent's plan is going to be go this way and just full send towards me. It's not a particularly difficult plan to see coming. So what was I going to do? Well, the deployment zone came down like here. If I just very quickly mark that one out roughly like so, and my deployment zone was something like this. I didn't feel like I had to be at the front of my deployment zone because I had thought about my opponent's threat ranges. So what was the threat going to be? Well, there is a battle magic caster in this unit over here, which means that either the Warpfire Dragon or the Chaos Knights could move not once, but they could move twice. So they're going to get back here. And if the Warpfire Dragon does it, it can go 20 inches, and then it can go another 20 inches. This means that it's very difficult to avoid. So what is the thinking? Well, I wanted to make sure that I had covered my bases. So the main thrust of the unit is the Sisters of the Avalon. This list is about keeping this unit alive, and they're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So I want them to be out of threat range. I don't want them to be turn 2 charged, and there's two things that I did to set that up. First of all, I baited out early drops. Pash knew what I was going to do. We both understood how the list was going to function, but we still tried to, get information against the other player where we could. So Silver Helms went down first over here. They went back so that my opponent couldn't shoot me with a Fireball turn 1 with his wizard inside the Chaos Knights. He could if he Arcane Urgency'd it forwards, but if he's only moving forwards 14 inches to then shoot a Fireball into the Silver Helms, I'm very happy. What I don't want him to do is, march forwards 14, march forwards 14, or double move the Warpfire Dragon but still get to magic missile the Silver Helms. I want to limit the options my opponent has. So for me, what I decided I was going to do is I was going to be 7.1 inches back from deployment zone. This meant that no matter where the Chaos Knights went down, they weren't going to be able to fireball me without Arcane Urgency themselves, and also only moving. So that would really shut down my opponent's ability to do things on turn 2. Second thing that I wanted to set up was to leave this space back here, because I realized that what I want is to have a long unit spread out. This unit ignores cover, so I can checker them quite handily in a skirmish formation, and they're all going to be able to see out in this direction. They've got a good angle of vision. I think I could see something like this with all of the models, basically. I guess it depends on the individuals, but you've got a good angle of sight, and they can move or TMP, so they're able to move around very comfortably. I also wanted them to be back, so I wanted them to be out of range of the turn 2 charge of the Chaos Knights. Even if they went 28 inches this way, they were outside of the charge range here, which means that they're 16, 28, 34. I think I was over 44 inches away, basically, from where the Chaos Knights could get to. So 44.1 inches away. That is the distance that I made sure. Yes, the Warpfire Dragon is going to be able to get into me if full sense forwards, but I can't avoid that. Moving 40 inches and then also charging 19 inches makes it very difficult, albeit impossible, to avoid. So we're avoiding the Chaos Knights with the Sisters of Avalon. That's the reason that they're back here. Then we've got the Prince. The Prince is deployed very specifically, and it's facing in this direction. And why is it facing this direction? Well, the Warpfire Dragon, if it moves 40 inches, the back of its base was about here. And through my vision arc, there was no way that it could get out of the vision arc. So if the Warpfire Dragon went forwards to charge the Sisters of Avalon, I was always going to be able to charge in with my Prince on Dragon, which is a fight that I feel comfortable that I can win. So I've set up a safe unit here, the Sisters of Avalon. They're not going to get ruined turn 1. I have the ability to cover the only thing that's going to get into them turn 2, the Warpfire Dragon, and I also set it up so even if the Chaos Knights come forwards, they're not able to get over here comfortably without being out of my angle of sight. I think my angle of sight went something like this, so you can see no matter who comes forwards, I'm able to charge in. I probably don't want to charge the Prince into the Chaos Knights, but it makes my opponent have less comfortable options. I don't want them to be able to just do stuff for free. Here's another example of a deployment that I played with a different list. This is the list that I've been playing with the Lothan Skycutters and a couple of smaller units of Sisters of Avalon, or 3 Skycutters in this version of the list. So in this version of the list, I'm playing against a Night Goblin Poison Shooting Brick, and this thing is designed to kill the Prince. So what do I want to do? I don't want to let it get too close. We were playing with the comped version of TMP, where your unit has to be, no model can move more than 12 inches, I believe it was. Or maybe it was, you had to be wholly within 12 inches. However, whatever it was, I knew that basically the threat range of this unit was to here, like so. So you move forwards, and then they've got an 18-inch range shooting aura. So it was something like this for turn 1. What I wanted to avoid was giving them an easy option to get the Prince in. So if I was deployed on the line, we'd worked out that you were able to get into the Prince very comfortably. How did I avoid that? Set the Prince up back here. So it is out of range. I think it was in range of the first row of shots, or maybe the first 2 rows of shots, but there was no way to get the full shooting might of the Night Goblin Brick into bear with the dragon, which means that even if you went to it, he was going to be here, which is not in a good spot. I'm going to be within range to charge because my charge range is 19 inches, his shooting range is 18 inches, and I feel pretty comfortable with that. So I've deployed the Prince back here to avoid that sort of threat. How have I approached deployment overall? Well, aside from making sure that I'm not getting shot by the Prince, the main thing I did was put my chaff drops down first. And in this list, despite them being heavy chariots in the rare slot, my chaff drops are the Lothan Skycutters. So I started off with 2 Skycutters off on the left, which is, it allows me to do a deployed flank deployment, which I will talk about in a second, and it also just gives me flexibility. They're super fast, they could march 20 inches, so let's say my opponent fully committed to this side here, and I don't really want to tangle with them with the Skycutters. Turn 1, I can just go, all right, I'm going to march this way behind the hill. I can hide very comfortably from the angles that you've given me here. This just feels like a very safe way for me to deploy some early units, and if my opponent does want to try and shoot them, they're 115 points, he has to full commit forwards, and then again, I've got angles to get in over here, which is very difficult for my opponent to deal with. So Skycutters drop down first because they're the ones that are flexible, they move very quickly, and if one of them dies turn 1, it's not the end of the world. The other Skycutter went over here, and this was just a case of I didn't want to put too much on one flank because then it makes it very obvious that I am trying to do a denied flank. Putting the Skycutter over here makes it seem more flexible. Then I went into the Silver Helms. In this game, I've identified that the Silver Helms are probably never going to charge into the Night Goblins, or not anytime soon. The reason for that is there are 9 Fanatics, and Fanatics basically just put a big zone of death around each unit here that you've got to respect. T3 models, they're getting wounded on 2s and only end up with a 6-up save after the Fanatics wound them. Not going to do all that much. So the Silver Helms started in marching column. This is something that I think is quite powerful because it allows me to pen in my opponent. My opponent's using TMP, Travel Mystical Pathways, and my game strategy here is going to be try and stop this unit from moving. So how do you do that? Well, it has to be wholly within 12 inches of where it starts, which is something like, if I just guesstimate, something like this. This is a horribly sloppy... You get the point. It has to be here. It also has to be outside of 6 inches of each model. So you can imagine there's just a little bubble around each model. So my goal is to fill up all of this space. So the Skycutter wants to go here, the Skycutter wants to go here, the Silver Helms want to go here, and then put the dragon over here and just stop the Night Goblin Brick from teleporting around. There is some risk inherent in this because the Fanatics can remove them. If you send Fanatics into models, they are going to kill stuff, then you're able to cast TMP afterwards. So there is, you've got to be careful with how you do it, but that is the goal for this deployment, and that's what I'm going for. If you are playing this sort of more control aspect in the game where you're playing a slower list, dwarves are a really good example of this. If you want to hear more about how to play dwarves, do go and check out Derry After Dark. He has done plenty of great videos about this. But something you might want to consider is how you're going to be putting your core units together. You probably want to stay pretty close together, unless you're doing something like marching a unit 27 inches or whatever it is that he does to throw a big unit up into the opponent's face, which is very effective. Let's say you want to play more defensively with your dwarves, and you've got a unit here, you've got a big melee combat res brick with some characters in, you've got some rangers who are shooting, and then you've got some iron drakes as well. This is a bad setup. I'm showing you this because this is a very obvious example of what not to do. So let's say you've got a shooting unit of rangers, a shooting unit of iron drakes, the melee unit of warriors, and then you've got some support behind as well, the Anvil of Doom. All looks good so far. Well, what's the problem? If your opponent brings in, let's say, a dragon, so if I just spawn in... you know what, Golrock, you'll do. You don't get used in games, so you may as well get used in the example. So your opponent's got a dragon. Let's say the dragon comes in, charges the rangers. Surprisingly, the rangers fail and flee combat. Immediately, you've got a problem here, because when they flee, which they will, you're going to go flee this way, and you can see that no matter what you roll, you are off the board. This is very bad, but it's very close to being very good, because you can set it up so that you've got it. Your opponent has to run into the unit behind and doesn't really have anywhere good to go, but doesn't have the option to overrun into something good. So as a very limited example, if we move the Anvil of Doom here, you can see that the rangers lose combat, they flee, they will never get caught because they're always going to flee through. They don't have enough movement to get off the board, or I guess they do in this example. You could be a little bit further forwards. This is just for the sake of the example. You rally because you're probably going to fall back in good order if you have stubborn or something similar, just a high leadership. And then Golrock does overrun and contacts into the unit with, let's say, a Dwarf King with the Rune of Smiting. This is a very strong setup for baiting in something that you want to kill, but you're never going to be able to catch because they're faster than you. It keeps the Rangers alive. All they've done is sacrifice their champion. They may have even done a little bit of damage into the dragon that's charged them with their standard shoot in the previous turns of shooting, and now the warriors are stuck into combat. Of course, after this, depending on whether you've got whether you're likely to give ground or not, you can set up something so that they're touched like here, meaning that after you give ground, your opponent then doesn't have the flexibility to test a restraint because you haven't moved anywhere because you're stuck in place. If you're worried about overrunning, you obviously need to be more careful, because if you fall back in good order here, you just run off the board, which would be terrible. But, this is just a very quick example of how you might want to set up some sort of layered defense where you've got your ranged unit at the front. They either flee from the charge or potentially hold, stand and shoot, and then sacrifice the champion for the challenge, run through the dragon there. Gives you some flexibility for a defensive list. Something to consider is, do I want to go for a denied flank or a refused flank, or do I want to bunker up in the center? Where you deploy your models, it very much depends on the terrain that you've got. So here you can see we're actually pretty poorly set up for going for one flank. If you do go for a flank, the main advantage to it is, let's say this was a hill instead. I'm just going to flatten these down. If this was a hill, you could just sort of play around this little corner here. Be careful not to get too close to the board edge. But if you do it correctly, maybe you put out like a chaff drop over here or something that can move fast and just rejoin the rest of the army over the first couple of turns, like copters for dwarves are very good at doing that in this sort of style army. Your opponent's probably going to set up some units over here, some units over here, some units over here, assuming that the terrain's not in the way. If you can bait them into doing that, and then you put all of your army over here, it's going to take them a long time to get this part of their army over to do anything important. And that's the main thing in terms of not losing in deployment. You don't want to have units not doing anything too much. Having one unit over here to bait out your opponent's drops is fine. But if it's an important unit that needs to be earning its points worth, you really want it to be more central, able to respond to wherever your opponent needs you to go. So that's something that's important to consider. Which units am I putting on the flank? probably the cheap ones, the ones that it doesn't matter if they don't get into combat or they don't get to affect the game for the first 3 or 4 turns. The stuff that does need to affect the game probably wants to be deployed more centrally, depending on terrain. If there's stuff in the center here, obviously you've got to go around it, so maybe you sort of deploy here with flexibility to go either way. Apologies for the scribbles there, but hopefully that illustrates what I'm talking about. Now, if you are playing the sort of, you want to go for a refused flank because you're playing a slower army, movement is one of the strongest stats in the game, and if you have a slow movement speed, you're at an immediate disadvantage, especially with how swift stride is in the game at the moment. So you probably want to deploy more defensively. If you're going for some sort of refused flank, you could be setting up, for example, a couple of shooting units here with some support behind them for when they lose combat, and then maybe a support piece behind them as well. This is not a great deployment example, but it gives you the vague understanding of, you see that you're covering your sides here. You don't want the dwarf warriors to get charged on the side, so you want to make sure that you're not giving them overruns through this unit that are super beneficial to them. The nice thing is you always have the opportunity. So if we just create a unit here, put in a dragon again. The dragon, it moves up, it threatens to charge. You always know where that dragon's going to end up, and obviously you want to set it up well in deployment, so this is maybe more something to go into in a different video, but you know where the overrun is going to be because you see where they're charging from. They have to move the shortest distance, and they also have to maximize. So in this case, the dragon's going to go basically straight forwards. It's hitting 4 models. It doesn't need to move at all other than that, so where it is fine. And that means it's going to go straight forwards. You can see from here. If it overruns, it'll go this way. That's pretty terrible, right? So you probably want to set up some better overruns in your deployment zone. You probably don't want to have to move if you can avoid it. You don't want to take movement penalties. So if you wanted to have Golrock charge into the front of these Iron Drakes, maybe you've got them at more of an acute angle, and then you've got these warriors further back here, so that when Golrock hits, wheels round, overruns, makes contact with the front of the unit. This is a very simple simplification of how you want to set up the overruns in your benefit, but it's important to do if you're playing something with a slower army, and that's where deployment comes in. Because if you have this army here, and I'll just get rid of that. Let's say you've set up your dwarves so that one unit's over here, one unit's over here, and then you've got this unit over here as well. You move 3 inches a turn. There is no way that you're going to be able to set up to cover the board so that this important unit can get behind here for the overrun, or can come over and try and flank charge if they manage to hold, say they've got stubborn or something like that. You need to set yourself up for success the slower your army is. So if you're playing a slow army, you probably want to be skewing closer together like this. Finally, in this example, what if you were playing the aggressive army? What if you were the beatdown? Well, you don't really want to run into the front of this big unit of dwarves because that's what they've set up. They've probably mathed it out. They've worked out that we're going to win on combat res, or my lord has a good chance of killing you because of the d6 damage on the Rune of Smiting. So you don't want to just run in there headlessly and end up losing the game. How do you deploy around that? Well, a good way to do it is, if you're worried about the shooting, say, for example, the Iron Drakes, you don't want to put the prince in range of where the Iron Drakes can shoot at turn 1. That's a super easy one. Obviously, you do characters last, but you want to know where the character's going while you're putting the rest of the stuff down. So let's say we're going to put a unit of Silver Helms down first. They're going to go over on the left-hand flank, and that gives them quite a wide angle of attack. They could go around here if you want to play it more slowly. More realistically, you're probably going to come up here and then try and attack from the left-hand side. What about the second unit? Well, let's go for something a bit more central, and this gives you 2 units that your opponent has to deal with. So you could go straight forwards here, and you've got pressure. They do have good rules, first charge. So if you're worried about your opponent just winning on combat res with the dwarf warrior with loads of static combat res in there, that's something that you can combo with putting the unit of Silver Helms in with the dragon as well. That gives you some flexibility. Third up, maybe the dragon wants to go over here. Why is this important? We're going to pincer our opponent. If you send the dragon up to, let's say, here, turn 1, something like that, and you've got the Silver Helms over here, turn 2, they can't realistically face both of you. Maybe you'd have to be a little bit further around, but You want it to be so that no matter which way they go, you're going to be able to get into the flank with one of the units, something along those lines. This is more easy to do if there's a single key unit to deal with, but you can also just make it so that, say, there's support behind. You're threatening, if you've got this one forwards as well, so you're threatening to attack the front with this unit, attack the left with this unit, attack the right with this unit. And again, maybe these need to be a little bit further over, something like this, something like this. However you set it up, it might take a couple of turns to set up before you just go in mindlessly. In this case, because you've gone wide, you've given yourself the option to set up a pincer where you can attack from all fronts and your opponent doesn't have a good way to defend against it. They're probably going to want to try and shoot something off the board to lower the amount of options, but if they wanted to shoot, for example, this way to kill the unit that's trying to flank charge them, then they're going to get flank charged by the dragon and then front charged here as well. So you're limiting your opponent's options. You're trying to pick apart a weakness that they have left in their deployment and hammer home as much as possible. What would have been a bad deployment? Well, probably just going straight forwards like this, because, what do dwarves have? Dwarves have good defensive stats. You're probably not winning if you just go like this. Theoretically, you should lose this on dice. You've got a dragon, so maybe you don't. But this isn't something that is setting you up for success, which is what you want to be doing when you're playing the aggressive list. So if you're playing aggressive, I think a pincer strategy is a very strong turn one. Obviously, you can also just, arcane urgency a dragon right in front of them and say, can you deal with me? But that's not necessarily always going to be the right option. Sometimes you do just have to bring in support from other units like so. Thank you for watching. I hope that was helpful. I hope that's made... Thank you for watching. I hope that's been useful. Maybe it's got the brain juices flowing a little bit. Is it going to change how you do anything? This is obviously very much sort of like an entry-level beginner's how to start thinking about deployment. Is there anything that you think I should have mentioned? Anything that you think I've missed? Anything that you do that you've beaten me with on the tabletop? Do let me know down below. Always interested in learning new strategies because there's so much depth to this game that is still left to be really mastered. I think that's really exciting. So thank you for watching. Thank you for getting to the end of the video. If you've reached this point and you haven't already, I would really appreciate a like, a comment, a subscription if you haven't done those things. It just helps me get seen by more people, boost me up in the algorithm, all of the stuff that the YouTubers do like to say. If you would like to support me in my goal to become a full-time YouTuber, I would absolutely appreciate that. You can become a member below. There are various perks to those, name at the end of the videos, all that good stuff, but it also unlocks some VIP areas in Discord if you become a Longbeard or Grey Knight tier supporter. Those VIP sections are the only parts that are locked away in Discord. You don't have to be a member to join the Discord. I'd recommend that you should. We've got about 450, 500 people on there. It's a great place for discussion, a lot of fun. I do try and chime in as much as possible. And it's also where the Fix My List show lists are put. And also if you are one of the Grail Knight or Longbeard tier supporters, where you participate in choosing which list I play in the monthly Pick My List series.